Hello, welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer, where we last left off in James and the Giant Peach. James and his two horrible aunts, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, were about to witness something peculiar, fantastically peculiar, about to happen to an ancient peach tree that never gave any peaches until now. Not only is there a peach on the tree, but now it's starting to grow. What will happen now? We'll just have to see. So you ready? Alright, let's begin. Chapter 7. The two women and the small boy stood absolutely still on the grass underneath the tree, gazing up at this extraordinary fruit. James's face was glowing with excitement, and his eyes were as big and bright as two stars. He could see the peach swelling larger and larger, as clearly as if it were a balloon being blown up. In half a minute, it was the size of a melon. In another half minute, it was twice as big again. "Just look at it growing!" Aunt Spiker cried. "Will it ever stop?" Aunt Sponge shouted, waving her fat arms and starting to dance around in circles. And now it was so big it looked like an enormous butter-colored pumpkin dangling from the top of the tree. That's one way to put it. "Get away from that tree trunk, you stupid boy!" Aunt Spiker yelled. "The slightest shake and I'm sure it'll fall off. It must weigh 20 or 30 pounds at least." The branch that the peach was growing upon was beginning to bend over further and further because of the weight. "Stand back!" Aunt Sponge shouted. "It's coming down! The branch is going to break!" But the branch didn't break. It simply bent over more and more as the peach got heavier and heavier. And still it went on growing. In another minute, this mammoth fruit was as large and round and fat as Aunt Sponge herself, and probably just as heavy. "It has to stop now," Aunt Spiker yelled. "It can't go on forever." But it didn't stop. Soon it was the size of a small car and reached halfway to the ground. Both aunts were now hopping around and around the tree, clapping their hands and shouting all sorts of silly things in their excitement. "Hallelujah!" Aunt Spiker shouted. "What a peach! What a peach! Terrifico!" Aunt Sponge cried out. "Magnifico! Splendifico!" "And what a meal! It's still growing! I know! As for James, he was so spellbound by the whole thing that he could only stand and stare and murmur quietly to himself, "Oh, isn't it beautiful? It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "Shut up, you little twerp!" Aunt Spiker snapped, happening to overhear him. "It's none of your business." "That's right," Aunt Sponge declared. "It's got nothing to do with you whatsoever. Keep out of it." "Look," Aunt Spiker shouted. "It's growing faster than ever now. It's speeding up." "I see it, Spiker. I do. It's speeding up." Bigger and bigger grew the peach. Bigger and bigger and bigger. Then at last, when it had become nearly as tall as the tree that it was growing on, as tall and wide, in fact, as a small house, the bottom part of it gently touched the ground. And there it rested. "It can't fall off now," Aunt Sponge shouted. "It stopped growing!" Aunt Spiker cried. "No, it hasn't. Yes, it has. It's slowing down, Spiker. It's slowing down. But it hasn't stopped yet. You watch it." There was a pause. "It has now. I believe you're right. Do you think it's safe to touch it? I don't know. We'd better be careful." Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker began walking slowly around the peach, inspecting it very cautiously from all sides. They were like a couple of hunters who had just shot an elephant and were not quite sure whether it was dead or alive. I really like the similes and interpretations he uses. And the massive round fruit towered over them so high that they looked like midgets from another world beside it. The skin of the peach was very beautiful, a rich buttery yellow with patches of brilliant pink and red. Aunt Sponge advanced cautiously and touched it with the tip of one finger. "It's ripe!" she cried. "It's just perfect! Now see here, Spiker, why don't we go and get us a shovel right away and dig out a great big hunk of it for you and me to eat?" "No," Aunt Spiker said. "Not yet." "Why ever not?" "Because I say so." Aunt Spiker must be the older one. "But I can't wait to eat some," and Sponge cried out. She was watering at the mouth now, and a thin trickle of spit was running down the side of her chin. Ugh. My dear Sponge, Aunt Spiker said slowly, winking at her sister and smiling a sly, thin-lipped smile. There's a pile of money to be made out of this, if only we can handle it right. You wait and see. Chapter 8. The news that a peach, almost as big as a house, had suddenly appeared in someone's garden spread like wildfire across the countryside, and the next day a stream of people came scrambling up the steep hill to gaze upon this marvel. Quickly Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker called in carpenters and had them build a strong fence around the peach to save it from the crowd. And at the same time, these two crafty women stationed themselves at the front gate with a large bunch of tickets and started charging everyone for coming in. Roll up, Aunt Spiker yelled. Only 1 shilling to see the giant peach. That's a 20th of a pound. Half price for children under 6 weeks old, Aunt Sponge shouted. I'm sure she meant 6 years old, or maybe not. One at a time, please. Don't push, you're all going to get in. Hey, you, come back here, you haven't paid. Look at everybody. Look at them smiling. By lunchtime, the whole place was a seething mass of men, women, and children, all pushing and shoving to get a glimpse of this miraculous fruit. Helicopters were landing like wasps all over the hill, and out of them poured swarms of newspaper reporters, cameramen, and men from the television companies. Do you think some of them came from the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation? Did it even exist in 1961? Oh, that's just me. It'll cost you double to bring in a camera, Aunt Spiker shouted. All right, they answered. We don't care. And the money came rolling into the pockets of the 2 greedy aunts. But while all this excitement was going on outside, poor James was forced to stay locked in his bedroom, peeping through the bars of his window at the crowds below. The disgusting little brute will only get in everyone's way if we let him wander about, Aunt Spiker had said early that morning. Oh, please, he had begged. I haven't met any other children for years and years, and there are going to be lots of them down there for me to play with. And perhaps I could help you with the tickets. Cut it out, Aunt Sponge had snapped. Your Aunt Spiker and I are about to become millionaires, and the last thing we want is the likes of you messing things up and getting in the way. Later, when the evening of the first day had come and the people had all gone home, the aunts unlocked James's door and ordered him to go outside and pick up all the banana skins and orange peels and bits of paper that the crowd had left behind. Could I please have something to eat first? He asked. I haven't had a thing all day. No, they shouted, kicking him out the door. We're too busy to make food. We are counting our money. So selfish. But it's dark, cried James. Get out, they yelled, and stay out until you've cleaned up all the mess. The door slammed. The key turned in the lock. Chapter 9. Hungry and trembling, James stood alone out in the open, wondering what to do. The night was all around him now, and high overhead a wild white moon was riding in the sky. There was not a sound, not a movement anywhere. Most people, and especially small children, are often quite scared of being out of doors alone in the moonlight. Everything is so deadly quiet, and the shadows are so long and thick, and they keep into strange shapes that seem to move as you look at them, and the slightest little snap of a twig makes you jump. James felt exactly like that now. He stared straight ahead with large, frightened eyes, hardly daring to breathe. Not far away in the middle of the garden, he could see the giant peach towering over everything else. Surely it was even bigger tonight than ever before. And what a dazzling sight it was! The moonlight was shining and glinting on its great curving sides, turning them to crystal and silver. And it looked like a tremendous silver ball lying there in the grass, silent, mysterious, and wonderful. And then all at once little shivers of excitement started running over the skin on James's back. Something else, he told himself. Something stranger than ever this time is about to happen to me again soon. He was sure of it. He could feel it coming. He looked around him, wondering what on earth it was going to be. The garden lay soft and silver in the moonlight. The grass was wet with dew, and a million dewdrops were sparkling and twinkling like diamonds around his feet. And now suddenly the whole place, the whole garden, seemed to be alive with magic. Almost without knowing what he was doing, as though drawn by some powerful magnet, James Henry Trotter started walking slowly towards the giant peach. He climbed over the fence that surrounded it and stood directly beneath it, staring up at its great, bulging sides. He put out a hand and touched it gently with the tip of one finger. It felt soft and warm and slightly furry, like the skin of a baby mouse. He moved a step closer and rubbed his cheek slightly against the soft skin. And then suddenly, while he was doing this, he happened to notice that right beside him and below him, close to the ground, there was a hole in the side of the peach. Chapter 10. It was quite a large hole, the sort of thing that an animal about the size of a fox might have made. James knelt down in front of it and poked his head and shoulders inside. He crawled in. He kept on crawling. This isn't just a hole, he thought excitedly. It's a tunnel. The tunnel was damp and murky, and all around him there was the curious bittersweet smell of fresh peach. The floor was soggy under his knees. The walls were wet and sticky, and peach juice was dripping from the ceiling. James opened his mouth and caught some of it on his tongue. It tasted delicious. He was crawling uphill now, as though the tunnel were leading straight towards the very center of the gigantic fruit. Every few seconds he paused and took a bite out of the wall. The peach flesh was sweet and juicy and marvelously refreshing. He crawled on for several more yards. And then suddenly, bang! The top of his head bumped into something extremely hard, blocking his way. He glanced up. In front of him there was a solid wall that seemed at first as though it were made of wood. He touched it with his fingers. It certainly felt like wood, except that it was very jagged and full of deep grooves. Good heavens, he said. I know what this is. I've come to the stone in the middle of the peach. Then he noticed that there was a small door cut into the face of the peach stone. He gave a push. It swung open. He crawled through it, and before he had time to glance up and see where he was, he heard a voice saying, "Look who's here!" And another one said, "We've been waiting for you." James stopped and stared at the speakers, his face white with horror. He started to stand up, but his knees were shaking so much he had to sit down again on the floor. He glanced behind him, thinking he could bolt back into the tunnel the way he had come, but the doorway had disappeared. There was now only a solid brown wall behind him. Chapter 11. James's large, frightened eyes traveled slowly around the room. The creatures, some sitting on chairs, others reclining on a sofa, were all watching him intently. Creatures? Or were they insects? An insect is usually something rather small, is it not? A grasshopper, for example, is an insect. So what would you call it if you saw a grasshopper as large as a dog? As large as a large dog? You could hardly call that an insect, could you? Maybe you could call it a gigantic insect. There was an old green grasshopper as large as a large dog sitting on a stool directly across the room from James now. And next to the old green grasshopper, there was an enormous spider. And next to the spider, there was a giant ladybug with 9 black spots on her scarlet shell. Each of these 3 was squatting upon a magnificent chair. On a sofa nearby, reclining comfortably in curled up positions, there was a centipede and an earthworm. On the floor over in the far corner, there was something thick and white. It looked as though it might be a silkworm, but it was sleeping soundly and nobody was paying any attention to it. Every one of these creatures was at least as big as James himself, and in the strange greenish light that shone down from somewhere in the ceiling, they were absolutely terrifying to behold. "I'm hungry," the spider announced suddenly, staring at James. "I'm famished," the old green grasshopper shouted. "So am I," the ladybug cried. The centipede sat up a little straighter on the sofa. "Everyone's famished," he said. "We need food." 4 pairs of round, black, glassy eyes were all fixed upon James. The centipede made a wriggling movement with his body as though he were about to glide off the sofa. But he didn't. There was a long pause and a long silence. Spider, who happened to be a female spider, opened her mouth and ran a long black tongue delicately over her lips. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked suddenly, leaning forward and addressing herself to James. Poor James was backed up against the far wall, shivering with fright and much too terrified to answer. "What's the matter with you?" the old green grasshopper asked. "You look positively ill." "He looks as though he's going to faint any second," the centipede said. "Oh my goodness, the poor thing!" the ladybug cried. I do believe he thinks it's him that we are wanting to eat." There was a roar of laughter from all sides. Oh dear, they said. "What an awful thought." "You mustn't be frightened," the ladybug said kindly. "We wouldn't dream of hurting you. You are one of us now. Didn't you know that? You are one of the crew. We're all in the same boat." "We've been waiting for you all day long," the old green grasshopper said. "We thought you were never going to turn up. I'm glad you made it." "So cheer up, my boy, cheer up," the centipede said. "And meanwhile, I wish you'd come over here and give me a hand with these boots. It takes me hours to get them off by myself." Chapter 12. James decided that this was most certainly not a time to be disagreeable, so he crossed the room to where the centipede was sitting and knelt down beside him. "Thank you very much," the centipede said. "You are very kind." "You have a lot of boots," James murmured. "I have a lot of legs," the centipede answered proudly, "and a lot of feet. 100 to be exact." "There he goes again," the earthworm cried, speaking for the first time. "He simply cannot stop telling lies about his legs. He doesn't have anything like 100 of them. He's only got 42. The trouble is that most people don't bother to count them. They just take his word. And anyway, there's nothing marvelous, Centipede, about having a lot of legs." "Poor fellow," the centipede said, whispering in James's ear. "He's blind. He can't see how splendid I look." "In my opinion," the earthworm said, "the really marvelous thing is to have no legs at all and to be able to walk just the same." "You call that walking?" cried the centipede. "You're a slitherer, that's all you are. You just slither along." "I glide," said the earthworm primly. "You are a slimy beast," answered the centipede. "I am not a slimy beast," the earthworm said. "I am a useful and much-loved creature. Ask any gardener you like. And as for you—" "I am a pest," the centipede announced, grinning broadly and looking around the room for approval. "He is so proud of that," the ladybug said, smiling at James. "Though for the life of me I cannot understand why. I am the only pest in this room." I am the only pest in this room," cried the centipede, still grinning away. "Unless you count old green grasshopper over there. But he's long past it now. He's too old to be a pest any more." The old green grasshopper turned his huge black eyes upon the centipede and gave him a withering look. "Young fellow," he said, speaking in a deep, slow, scornful voice, "I have never been a pest in my life. I am a musician." "Hear, hear," said the ladybug. "James," the centipede said. "Your name is James, isn't it?" "Yes." "Well, James, have you ever in your life seen such a marvelous, colossal centipede as me?" "I certainly haven't," James answered. "How on earth did you get to be like that?" "Very peculiar," the centipede said. "Very, very peculiar indeed. Let me tell you what happened. I was messing about in the garden underneath the old peach tree, and suddenly a funny little green thing came wriggling past my nose. Bright green it was, and an extraordinary beautiful, and it looked like some kind of a tiny stone or crystal." "Oh, but I know what that was," cried James. "It happened to me, too," said the ladybug. And me, Miss Spider said. Suddenly there were little green things everywhere. The soil was full of them. I actually swallowed one, the earthworm declared proudly. So did I, the ladybug said. I swallowed 3, the centipede said. But who's telling the story anyway? Don't interrupt. It's too late to tell stories now, the old green grasshopper announced. It's time to go to sleep. I refuse to sleep in my boots, the centipede cried. How many more are there to come off, James? I think I've done about 20 so far, James told him. Then that leaves 80 to go, the centipede said. 22, not 80, shrieked the earthworm. He's lying again. The centipede roared with laughter. Stop pulling the earthworm's leg, the ladybug said. This sent the centipede into hysterics. Pulling his leg? He cried, wiggling glee and pointing at the earthworm. Which leg am I pulling? You tell me that. James decided that he rather liked the centipede. He was obviously a rascal. Huh. You should hear the performance Richard Dreyfuss gives in the movie. But what a change it was to hear somebody laughing once in a while. He had never heard Aunt Sponge or Aunt Spiker laughing aloud in all the time he had been with them. We really must get some sleep, the old green grasshopper said. We've got a tough day ahead for us tomorrow. So would you be kind enough, Miss Spider, to make the beds? To be continued.